Is evolution a fact? In the early 3rd century, BC, in the city of Athens, a man by the name of Zeno of Citium, a Hellenistic philosopher of Phoenician origin, founded a fatalistic philosophy involving a type of naturalistic pantheism. This deterministic philosophy came to be known as Stoicism. Unlike the Abrahamic religions that personalized God as a world-creating entity, Stoicism equated God with the totality of the universe. For Stoics, emotional thinking was considered a bad way of belief, and logic and reason were declared to be far more sufficient in understanding reality. Stoics held to the belief that Mother Nature was the creator of the world, and all existence is cyclical. The cosmos is eternally self-recreating and self-destroying, the universe is at a certain stage of its cycle following an infinite number of previous universes, and destined to be destroyed also, and then recreated infinite times. This was a huge departure from the traditional idea of an ultimate intelligent creator. In modern times a similar philosophy arose with the advent of modern science. A philosophical belief system now known by many as Neo-Darwinism, a kind of materialist evolutionism, and it has become popular with atheists, who posit that evolution is what created everything. Today, some scientists have developed an idea similar to the ancient Stoics involving an infinite multiverse. So in many ways, this idea is an unintended reiteration of the ancient Stoic philosophy. In a very similar way to the ancient Stoic superstitions, some scientists believe that everything, the origin of the universe and the origin of life, is an upwardly evolving result of unguided natural processes sprouting from an infinite multiverse of actualities, and some have asserted it upon the public as a fact, so we do well to take a closer look at it and scrutinize this extraordinary claim, that has been made by some very prominent people. The Neo-Darwinian construct of how the world took shape, is claimed by many to be a purely scientific theory, and unfettered by the chains of religious belief. Many people would prefer to think that God exists, but atheists would probably retort by claiming such to be wishful thinking. The alternative, less wishful, more pessimistic idea, that we are the product of a vast series of super unlikely cosmic accidents, perhaps happening at one place, and at one time, enabled by infinite possibility space, and therefore our unique individual existence is ultimately meaningless, is a popular viewpoint today among many atheists and some evolutionists. So let's get to the bottom of this problem, before we pull it apart. Why is there this ongoing argument between creationists and evolutionists? Because it is about competing beliefs, or claims, of two different creators. One claimed creator is simply that nature is ultimately responsible for the origin of life and the origin of the universe. The other claimed creator is God. Which God? Usually, it is posited to be the Judeo-Christian God of the Bible, Jehovah. Evolution is claimed to be a creative process, but creationists are skeptical of that idea. How then can these two claims be scientifically tested? How do these two competing hypotheses get analyzed to determine which idea is more likely, if no human observed these creative events happening? Some evolutionists suggest that we do see these creative events happening right now, in front of our eyes, but it happens too slow for us to see it turning into something more complex. Has anyone ever seen more complexity naturally emerge from less complexity, without intelligence, or pre-existing information, and if so, what do you mean by complexity and information? Existential doubt is the psychological torture of our era, for which atheistic Darwinism has played the largest part. Some people like to think that we can remove all emotion, so that our thinking can be purely analytical, and seek to come to a rational understanding of it all. And so, in a Stoic manner, for the sake of science, we want to employ cold hard logic, and because of our emotional makeup and self-awareness, we try hard to put the apparent inevitability of our eventual non-existence, and its possible permanence, out of our minds, as much as we can. because it seems unthinkably bleak and hopeless. But in our darkest moments, uncertainty looms its ugly head, so that we are faced with the reality of it more often, as our death gets closer and closer. But even agnostic people will try to temper this soul-crushing sense of futility by seeking comfort with the idea that someday, God, if he exists, might reveal himself somehow, so that there might be some possible hope for a continued existence beyond our current lifespan, and therefore wonder if such a hope, and a sense of self, can be logically substantiated. For example, the Christian doctrine of resurrection. But how can we make such a determination scientifically? Is it even possible? Perhaps we could start by asking, why do we see a universe that is so differentiated, ordered, very far from a state of thermal equilibrium, and intricately complex? Did it begin this way, or did it get to be this way, due to natural processes, over a long time? Why is it that some scientists believe that the intelligent design of nature is real, while other scientists don't? Who is more rational? In which of these two opposite views does truth or falsehood ultimately reside? How do we separate fact from only belief, or the known from the unknown, and emotion from cold hard logic? By what method can we determine what is real, what is not real, what we still don't know, and what we still cannot distinguish, one way or the other? What about the scientific method of trying to understand reality? Richard Feynman explained the scientific method very fundamentally. In his lectures to his students, he discussed how we look for a new law in science. He said, in general, we look for a new law by the following process. First we guess it. Then we compute the consequences of the guess to see if what we guessed is right, to see what it would imply. And then we compare those computational results to nature, or we say, compared to experiment or experience, compared directly with observation to see if it works. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. In that simple statement is the key to science. It doesn't make any difference how beautiful your guess is. It doesn't make any difference how smart you are, or who made the guess, or what his name is. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. That's all there is to it. The experiment itself must be well designed, and we can infer that this is what Feynman meant. The gold standard is that the experiment is checked properly and must be repeatable, to make sure that the experiment itself has not been bungled, to accomplish the due diligence required for scientific inquiry, to meet the falsifiability standard, the kind of experiment other people can do, and independently verify, or can in principle attempt to prove wrong. So by this process of elimination, we can reduce our ignorance. So, what if we were to assume the two competing explanations of our origins as guesses, or models, one being God, as our creator, and the other being evolution, as our creator? How do we determine which explanation is more plausible? According to the Feynman standard of scientific inquiry, if it disagrees with experiment, then, for scientific purposes, we must conclude that the idea is wrong. So, is the atheistic evolutionary belief system plausible for explaining our creator, or is the explanation contained within the older, more traditional Judeo-Christian belief system a more plausible explanation of our ultimate creator? Which idea is in harmony with experimental evidence? On the other hand, which idea contains more unsubstantiated beliefs that go against properly conducted physical experiments? For example, which empirical observations are more in agreement with the second law of thermodynamics, the idea of intelligent creation, or mindless upward evolutionary creation? One of the most controversial theories in recent history has been the theory of Darwinian evolution. There have even been court cases over it and, although not unprecedented, for science this is quite extraordinary. It is quite a popular theory of modern times. Some have questioned whether it can rightfully be called a theory. So a scientist needs to ask certain questions. How do you test it? What is the experiment? What has been demonstrated in the laboratory? What does the evidence show us? What does it not show us? Many people have been dazzled by the scientific achievements of our modern technological era, and therefore might be inclined at times to place much trust in hypothetical ideas. This could lead to a situation where one is lulled into a lack of critical thinking about such human ideas, and fail to question their scientific truth, because they find such an idea appealing to their current way of life, and therefore the idea falls within their comfort zone. Mainstream educational institutions sometimes tell people what to think, instead of telling them how to think critically. A person's worldview, however, doesn't affect the reality of things. Therefore, the scientific method is one of the only ways we have of partially revealing universal truth, that is not limited to, and distorted, by our subjective view of the world. Ideally, it's a good way of overcoming any confirmation bias. However, the world is not an ideal place. Evolution is a rather loaded word for many people these days, especially for those with a biblical creation worldview, or those with other religious beliefs, and also for agnostics who often point out problems with Darwinism. Many evolutionists like to bombastically assert that evolution is a fact. In some sense, they are correct. Evolution is a fact. The word evolution simply means change over time, or how things unfold over time, and this certainly does happen. In reality, things do change over time. You have probably seen things of one kind or another change over time in your everyday life. Even you as a person change over time. The real issue is, how do physical things unfold or change over time? Do they get better over time, or do they get worse over time? Do they gain complexity and function over time, or do they lose complexity and function over time? Can both those opposite ideas be directly observed happening? The controversial type of evolution that we are discussing here is the philosophical system of Darwinian evolution. Like a lot of theories, it contains many facts, hypotheses, that is guesses, or speculative ideas. In times past, especially more recent history, many phenomena were successfully explained by natural causes, and proven as such, and so it has been taken for granted by some people that life's origins and varieties can be explained and proven in a similar fashion. Darwinian evolutionists boldly claim that living organisms from one generation to the next can sometimes get better, more organized, more complex, and so by breeding over many generations, they are imagined to have gradually developed in an upward direction of more complexity and increasing functionality, through random variations, genetic mutations and unplanned natural selection, of appropriate adaptive compatibility to the surrounding environment, of a particular time period, and an imagined portion of these hypothetical upward improvements would then increase an organism's chance of survival and therefore get preserved and passed on to the offspring, and so the imagined upward process would therefore be subject to the well-known principle of natural selection, and it is sometimes speculated that perhaps there might be some other unknown processes that create improvement as well, that have yet to be discovered. And when first heard it sounds like a reasonable idea. Many imaginative artistic renderings have been devoted to illustrating these ideas and making them seem plausible, and others believe that the ancient fossils might be suggestive of a Darwinian, upward, evolutionary history. But this teaching is neither sacred nor unquestionable. Of course, atheists have to be committed to the imagined idea that everything started simple and over time became more and more complex, somehow naturally. Otherwise, their entire worldview collapses, because it is the major cornerstone of their claimed disbelief of God's existence. And so, for whatever reason, maybe from skepticism or from perhaps sometimes even an emotional need to criticize older belief systems that are inherently more traditional, there is a commitment to defend this atheistic worldview. But how much of this concept has ever been observed and proven? Without any apparent divine intervention, to stop evil, some people doubt God's existence. On the other hand, without the existence of naturally occurring upward evolution, it would seem there is no foundation for materialist atheism. When we use the true scientific method and put the doctrine of upward evolution to the test, what can we observe in reality, without having to rely on guessing and assumptions? Is there a consistent repeatable experience in nature, that can reveal the truth of things in the real world? Is there a mathematical argument? How does that shed light on the ancient fossils and geology? The Darwinian evolution theory is a complicated subject. All theories have their limitations. Humbly, Newton's empirical theory of gravity did not attempt to explain what gravity is, but only what gravity does, and was able to measure and calculate certain things but not others. It could calculate how objects fall to Earth, but could not calculate the strange spirographic orbit of Mercury. Einstein's a priori theory of gravitation, his relativity theory, was not confined to just the empirical aspect of what gravity does, but contained some philosophical ideas about what the cause of gravity might be, and from this, it was able to successfully calculate the orbital path of Mercury. From this imaginative idea, it has proven useful in enabling and maintaining the accuracy of the world's GPS. So his idea of space-time as a fabric that warps and curves, which cannot be empirically observed, nonetheless turned out to be a sufficient gap filler to derive accurate calculations from. And after many decades of the severest scientific testing, it remains unfalsified. It agrees with all experiments so far. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection correctly explains how small local changes within species can happen, and can be verified by much empirical demonstration of how the small observable local changes we see in organisms occur. But what about the larger differences that exist throughout all life forms? Mendel's proven theory of genetics is very useful in this regard. But does natural selection acting on inherited variations and mutations provide us with a satisfactory explanation for all those larger differences that exist now? Is it able to give us proof of a sufficient mechanism to substantiate the idea of a tree of life and universal common ancestry? Does the idea of living things evolving upward to greater functional complexity by natural laws agree with experiments? Can it provide us with a complete mathematical computational logical pathway? Actually, no, it cannot. Not at the time of this writing. Beyond that, who knows? If natural causes have not been empirically demonstrated as sufficient to create new, more complex life forms, then perhaps another idea might be called for. Perhaps a cause that cannot be observed might provide a sufficient verifiable, a priori explanation that agrees with experiments and observed consistent natural laws, along with their repeatable effects. Which of the two claimed creative causes agree more with thermodynamic principles and experiments? God or evolution? Einstein wanted to believe that God does not play dice with the universe. Some atheists might say that God is less tenable as an idea for creation, because no human today can observe God doing anything miraculous, and the world is degenerating into illness, evil, and suffering. But the honest atheist also has to acknowledge that no one has ever observed the existence of any mindless, upward, evolution process creating anything of more complex novelty either. We do see plenty of downward change, things decaying, and this is a repeatable experience everywhere in nature. But if this is the only way that nature runs, then how did it all begin more ordered? Maybe, in the beginning, God did it after all. Who can say? In this context, not a scientist, although a scientist cannot say that nature runs uphill either, when deprived of extra energy or information from outside the system, so it at least agrees more with the idea of God as a creator, even if those creative processes were never observed, or that we cannot understand how God can exist in the first place. The atheist might object and say that evil and suffering in the world is not compatible with the existence of an infinite all-powerful God. But if Niels Bohr were alive today, he might say to the atheist, The same as he said to Albert Einstein, "Einstein, stop telling God what to do." Many assume evolution to be the doctrine of atheism, but Charles Darwin did not claim to be an atheist. He liked the idea that God created the physical laws in such a way that might have enabled life to evolve in an upward direction, of increasing complexity. It's interesting to note that it is generally recognized in modern physics that the physical laws appear very precisely fine-tuned, in such a balanced way, that has allowed the universe to exist the way we see it today. But many who have come after Darwin have attempted to extrapolate his idea to eliminate the God hypothesis, making it an argument by exclusion. Thereby some people have tenuously used it as support for atheism, so in modern times we see a large part of the scientific community ideologically driven to exclude supernatural intelligent causation from their explanatory toolbox, all supposedly in the name of preventing intellectual laziness in the science room, what is also known as avoiding the God of the gaps shortcut, and the other idea is to stay within the philosophy of naturalism. So, they deliberately and arbitrarily leave themselves with no alternative but to formulate naturalism of the gaps hypotheses. When observing such Neo-Darwinism and the new atheism with its opposition against theologians, creationists, and intelligent design advocates, most scientists are cautious and remain neutral in this debate. Sometimes, however, popularizers within the scientific arena enjoy being controversial because it attracts attention and generates publicity, and helps to sell their books. For those predisposed against the notion of God's existence, or even those who are simply skeptical, perhaps these types of writings might provide some kind of confirmation bias. But for others, it's simply claimed to be a form of rigorous objective inquiry via polemicism. Carl Sagan was a popularizer of materialist ideology. When he presented the TV series Cosmos in the 80s, he opened it by saying, "The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be." This is an extraordinary claim, which is ironic because Sagan himself famously said that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Can Sagan's idea be falsified? It seems to be a knowledge claim, of something no human could ever have any real knowledge of. Maybe a more humble approach to the question of existence and its origins is more appropriate at this point unless we can find a definitive answer using empirical evidence. In a certain context, the constraint of using only methodological naturalism to explain the origin of things is considered to be an intrinsic part of the Neo-Darwinian philosophy. Although atheism might have been logically tenable before Darwin, wrote the famous atheist Richard Dawkins, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Whether you agree or disagree with Dawkins, he has certainly prompted a lot of people to think harder, by playing devil's advocate, in this epic debate. In debating academic agnostic David Blinsky, on the question, does atheism poison everything? Atheist Christopher Hitchens, arguing for evolutionist ideas, and criticizing religion, said, "Man forged manacles of terror and ignorance and stupidity, the emancipation of which of our species has been millimetrically slow, but in which materialist and atheistic thinkers have played a great part." Another very famous atheist, Antony Flew, the world's most foremost academic atheist over a 50-year period, in later life changed his mind. He first advanced his argument for atheism when debating a former atheist turned Christian, C.S. Lewis. He was the author of more than 30 books. He wrote a paper called Theology and Falsification, which became the most widely reprinted philosophical publication for half a century and a key foundation for atheists and agnostics who advanced materialist evolutionism. Flew's arguments against the existence of God were: 1. The universe is eternal, it has always existed and always will. 2. Life is a random process, the result of an accidental product of chemical interactions. 3. The existence of God is a self-contradiction, and evil is not compatible with the existence of God. But it was the advancement of science that changed the mind of Flew and some scientists. In a summit at New York University, Flew changed his position to believing in God as the creator of the universe. He said, "It is all in my view a matter of the enormous complexity by which the results are achieved, which look to me like the work of intelligence." He turned to various discoveries of science to prove his point. From the fossil records showing the sudden appearance of a fully developed life, to the emergence of visual consciousness across the animal kingdom, to the basic need for reproduction. But it is the manifestation of life written in DNA, and the transcription of DNA to RNA, and RNA into protein, and the subsequent process of protein folding that makes the best case for Flew. He said, "What I think the DNA material has done, has shown by almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements that lead to producing this being, that intelligence must have been involved in getting these extraordinarily diverse elements to work together." On another occasion Flew also said, "It seems to me that Richard Dawkins constantly overlooks the fact that Darwin himself, in the 14th chapter of The Origin of Species, pointed out that his whole argument began with a being which already possessed reproductive powers. This is the creature the evolution of which a truly comprehensive theory of evolution must give some account." Darwin himself was well aware that he had not produced such an account. It now seems to me that the findings of more than 50 years of DNA research have provided materials for a new and enormously powerful argument to design. Exclusive interview with former atheist Anthony Flew, by Dr. Gary R. Habermas from Craig J. Hazen, Ph.D. Professor of Comparative Religion, Biola University Editor, Philosophia Christi. As more time has passed and modern genetics has advanced more, it is becoming more apparent that a comprehensive theory of evolution would also require more than what it currently has to explain the idea of any imagined increase in complex biological functions of any successive generation of organisms, that evolutionists postulate, due to the specified complexity of the genetic code. There doesn't seem to be many degrees of freedom within the genetic code to produce any specific functional protein, and this is where one real battle by science is now taking place as to the question of origins. From a human standpoint, it might seem that the battle that has been going on for decades between evolutionists and creationists may not end any time soon. So, we have some people who are satisfied with the evolutionists' ideas, and we have others who have changed their minds because of more recent scientific discoveries. What do we make of all this? Even those who do have a personal belief in God, often adhere to naturalism that excludes intelligent design, especially in areas of physics research and engineering, and it has been asserted by people like Dawkins, that not to do so in the science room would constitute intellectual laziness. However, others claim that the design perspective greatly assists their scientific inquiry, and that having such a perspective enabled them to ask the right questions, and make certain discoveries. So, which way is better? Are there other constraints that need to be adhered to? Is design just a product of natural selection? As discussed another time, some say that the reason for exclusive naturalism is for methodological grounds only, so that scientific investigation can remain rational and objective. Others say that, when it comes to the origin of life, and the origin of various life forms, and the origin of the universe, this naturalistic approach cannot provide a satisfactory complete rational explanation of them. It is sometimes argued that it is for anti-religious reasons, and fear of ridicule by one's peers, that intelligent design is excluded. As a result, others argue that such exclusion lacks character. Some people also might argue that sometimes an intelligent design concept is excluded because some do not like the thought of being accountable to God for their activity. However, others disagree and take issue and say that this is an emotional position unsuitable for scientific discipline, and instead assert that it is because some long-held religious beliefs have been scientifically proven wrong, and science does not invoke God of the gaps explanations, and therefore the Neo-Darwinian concept of origins is adhered to by some scientists, although for most scientists, this is not relevant to their particular field of study. Others also point to how certain religious ideologies have failed in the past, causing much inhumanity and suffering, and because of religion's abominable past deeds it can no longer be viewed as reliable. However, it can be equally said that pseudo-scientific theories have been used also to justify evil atrocities at similar scales in more recent history. Yet others argue that not all belief systems should be tarred with the same brush, and there is also plenty of unproven beliefs contained within parts of the scientific community as well, a kind of naturalism of the gaps philosophy. Who knows which way this whole thing will ultimately go? Is it any wonder that so many people today are confused? Superstitiously, it is almost as though there is some kind of evil puppet master in the background, manipulating people's emotions. But we should not let our imagination run wild. Let's try and get to the bottom of it all using objectivity instead. So it's not so much an interpretation of traditional religion only, but overall, it is more about other ideologies too, that seems to be the problem here. Darwinism's interpretation of facts has at times been criticized and characterized as pseudoscience, and various interpretations of the Bible canon have been criticized as well, but much of either remains an open question. Because of this kind of guesswork, it is little wonder then that because of such confusion, many scientists remain agnostic and indifferent to such arguments because, in scientific terms, this ongoing debate seems time-wasting and fruitless. But for other possible more beneficial reasons to do with human psychology and mental health, others, including those with a more spiritual perspective, would disagree and believe that there are more meaningful answers to be found from scientific inquiry. Who knows? So why then is it often called the theory of evolution? It is not just a single theory, but encompasses many types of evolution: factual, theoretical, and hypothetical. The unobservable, both the theoretical and the hypothetical parts of this compound theory, are built on the observable and scientifically proven parts. The theoretical parts have not been fully proven, but some parts of them have at least been found to agree with certain findings, although nothing definitive that would disprove the intelligent design perspective of the natural world. A theory, in orthodox scientific terms, is something that you can test by experimentation and get repeatable, predictable empirical results that agree with it and verify it, and there has to be a way of attempting to prove it false. Otherwise, it is not a legitimate scientific theory, but possibly an argument from ignorance. If an experiment shows results that disagree with the theory is either discarded, or modified ad hoc to fit the experimental results, which is often allowed. But this too must be testable, otherwise, you have crossed over from science to faith, which is quite often frowned upon. But ironically, not always. So why is there so much controversy for certain people, when calling evolution a theory and a fact? The problem comes from not making the definitions within Darwinian evolution theory clear enough for much of the general public. Conflated arguments are sometimes made with blanket declarations instead of being specific in their descriptions, and deplorably, sometimes by people who are supposed to know better. The word evolution by itself does not have a specific enough meaning to make clear the distinction between which parts of it are fact, which parts of it are theory, and which parts of it are hypothetical, and therein lies the problem. Scientists understand that there are different types of evolution within the generally accepted evolution theory. They also acknowledge the gaps of ignorance contained within many of these theoretical, hypothetical ideas. And this is sometimes accompanied by superfluous and time-wasting arguments, when not identified and defined. It is a vast theorem, encompassing many disciplines. So why has it been so controversial? The evolution theory today is assumed by many to mean that everything in the universe, including life, has been speculated to have evolved through natural physical processes, and without intelligent direction from a creative conscious superbeing. But regardless of whether the molecules to man idea is true or not, some of the tenets are factual and empirically proven beyond doubt, while some of these things are theoretical but still experimentally testable. But then, some of them also are hypothetical or only speculative, and even lack explanatory power, and therefore faith-based, and sometimes even credulous. It is a rather complicated affair. The lines can often be blurred. The universe doesn't always conform to our desires in a way that we would like to neatly categorize and pigeonhole everything. Life not only consists of matter and energy but also information. If only we humans could have been able to understand life processes when all of it was reduced down to its fundamental components, the same way that light can be split into its various spectra and have distinguished the quantized properties of matter and energy. Biology, however, has proven to be a far more tricky proposition. No biologist today is under the illusion that it could ever be that simple. The deeper science drills down into it, the more complex it looks. How do you take a cell apart, put a cell back together, and make it live again? Nobody knows. Some put faith in the idea that science will one day solve these problems too. Most parts of this set of theories can be classified as historical science because they are trying to figure out what happened in the past, by finding evidence left behind in the present. So an imagined story is laid on top of the evidence, and tested. Stellar evolution is the theory of how stars get born, how they might exist for a calculated or estimated amount of time and come to their end. There is a mixture of astronomy, theoretical physics, and astronomical history involved in this discipline. Physics is both factual, theoretical, and experimentally testable. For example, thermodynamics can be classified as an operational science. Certainly, many experiments can be done in the study of thermodynamics that can assist one to observe and measure change over time in a system, and have predictable, repeatable results. Because of this kind of reproducibility in the experiments, we can certainly view this type of evolution as both fact and theory. Even computer models can be built, such as universe simulations, weather or climate simulations, or engineering scenarios of one kind or another, and provide good predictions of how these physical systems evolve. Engineers can calculate efficiency losses from it. It also often has some historical value, because we can extrapolate into the past and make probabilistic guesses. For example, the second law of thermodynamics can infer a more ordered past, and predict a more disordered future. So, much of this kind of evolution is proven beyond doubt. But, the motion of these chemicals and forces interacting, are not living, functioning, biological organisms. In scientific terms, the step over from non-life to life is a ludicrously vast and gaping chasm of ignorance, not fully tested and, at the time of this writing, never empirically proven to ultimately originate by either natural or supernatural means. Believing either is faith. Believing neither is agnostic. There is not one abiogenesis idea, nor any experiment, that can even provide an adequate explanation for the origin of life. And all are purely speculative ideas, because there is no convincing evidence to support mindless natural processes forming life at all. The origin of life is said to be a mystery, or an enigma, for all of science. It either falls within the realm of religious belief or agnosticism, but any evidence in the positive remains as yet outside the realm of science. Although there is plenty of experimental evidence in the negative, to show how it probably cannot happen, because of what has been so far observed, is that all things degrade over time, they always go down, and never up, when left to nature, and this seems to be an inconvenient truth for committed atheists. For such a situation to reverse would be miraculous. But in principle, scientists are not allowed to invoke or appeal to miracles, so ideally you would imagine that this is excluded right away, and yet things are not always as they would seem. ID advocate Dr. Stephen Meyer says that the idea of chemical evolution is a complementary idea to other evolutionary ideas, to try and explain the first life from non-life, along with macroevolution, and this is an indispensable plank in the purely materialistic worldview of how everything including the universe came into existence. Microevolution, or variation within existing species, or within interbreeding populations, that is, the small-scale changes or variations, are observable, testable, and are in accordance with repeatable experience, and therefore a fact. Look at all the different breeds of dogs in the world today as an example of that. In reality, humans have been observing a certain amount of variation for thousands of years, when selectively breeding animals and plants. It has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. So microevolution, being that it is the observable change over time, seems to go back and forth within certain observed limits or boundaries, and the modern understanding of genetics provides us with a logical, testable explanation for these phenomena. Microevolution is empirical, testable, and also fulfills the falsifiability standard for it to be viewed as a scientifically correct theory. It is an objective truth. 43 years before it was labeled microevolution, the person who broke significant ground in this area of scientifically understanding heredity was Gregor Johann Mendel, who lived the 20th of July 1822 to the 6th of January 1884, who posited that heredity is the result of discrete units of inheritance, that every single unit, or gene, was independent in its actions in an individual's genome. According to this concept, the inheritance of a trait depends on the passing on of these discrete units. Mendel's experiments with pea plants were carried out between 1856 and 1863, which established many of the principles about how heredity works. It was only after Mendel's death that this idea was properly recognized as scientific truth. Genetic information was from that time on far more recognized as being a prime necessity for life processes. Some people object to the word microevolution because it can confuse people because of its similarity to the word macroevolution. The imagined idea of macroevolution implies hypothetical larger scale changes toward greater functional complexity that cannot be observed. No one has ever witnessed upward transformations happening, and difficult, maybe even impossible in some ways, to test or falsify. One reason for this is because its proponents often claim that it takes vast amounts of time, perhaps longer than a human lifespan, to become noticeable, although it is starting to become apparent that there are other ways of theoretically testing it and theoretically falsifying it, because upward reproductive change has not yet been conclusively observed in the real world. So the idea is subjective at this level of investigation. But even that subjectivity begins to melt away upon further investigation. The only sort of reproduction observed and scientifically confirmed has been either reiterative or degenerative, but the prospect of finding anything beyond that has only remained speculative. However, the concept itself is an interesting hypothesis and a very well formulated question for research purposes. Perhaps because of all the evil and suffering in the world, and no human at various times of history had ever witnessed any sort of divine miraculous event, the idea of upward evolution was born out of skepticism of the supernatural and the various creation dogmas of the day, and therefore an alternative naturalistic explanation for the origin of all the biological diversity on planet Earth was posited by people like Charles Darwin and others, which later became known as macroevolution, and is in the realm of the hypothetical and the speculative, generally regarded as a just-so story, as one possible hypothetical explanation for the origin of biological complexity and all its various forms, but was not an explanation for the origin of first life, that Darwin guessed might have been a single cell. Russian entomologist Yuri Filipchenko first coined the terms macroevolution and microevolution in 1927, in his German-language work, Variabilität und Variation. The speculative macroevolution process has never been directly observed, but can be anecdotally inferred from ancient fossils, and is also an incompletely imagined extrapolation from the well-observed microevolution. No one has thought up a complete logical pathway for this, but many consider it a good guess for examination. It has been said, at first glance, all the evil and suffering and death in the world seem compatible with the idea of upward Darwinian evolution. When Charles Darwin, who lived the 12th of February 1809 to the 19th of April 1882, wrote his book Origin of Species, long before the modern advent of Mendelian genetic theory was finally accepted by the mainstream, Darwin thought that small changes that can be observed in animals over a few generations might imply bigger, unobservable changes over a huge multitude of generations and vast amounts of time. He felt that by extremely slight modifications over billions of years, it could be imagined to eventually end up implying a tree of life, meaning that every life form on Earth today might have descended from a common ancestor, perhaps a simple cell. In modern scientific terms, his idea has turned out to be oversimplistic, as one would expect, with the advances in science. Darwin even guessed at the time he might find a logical pathway for how an organ like an eye might have upwardly evolved from something of lesser complexity, but he had no knowledge in his time of DNA. And very little, if any, knowledge of how important a role that genetic information must play in life processes. The discovery of DNA disrupted the older Darwinian ideas. Macroevolution hypothetically infers that things would have ascended, not just descended, from a common ancestor. That is to say, now it is to be assumed by Neo-Darwinian evolutionists that they gained functional complexity in their DNA information and their molecular machinery and body architecture over successive generations, because of more advanced scientific knowledge of the necessity for the genetic code in all life forms. And so, vaguely imagined upward genetic mutations must be posited, to try and keep the macroevolution hypothesis tenable, and also that Darwin's hypothetical tree of life might continue to appear plausible. Similarities and differences in different species and kinds, both in living examples and fossils, and also the hypothesis that genetic mutations can sometimes increase functional complexity, are some of the ideas that attempt to support the belief system that evolution is the creative process of all life forms. In today's world, many scientists have been trained with exclusive naturalism, and have not had the opportunity to examine the ongoing controversy of the creation-evolution debate. When many of these newly trained scientists are first confronted with it, it comes as a shock to their mindset. Many have been raised from childhood with a secular worldview. As a result of this shocking affront to their thinking process, you get much bias and often very little open-mindedness at all. There is sometimes a refusal by some to recognize microevolution and macroevolution as having much difference. Many scientists are of the view that there are only material causes for things. This materialist philosophy sometimes causes people to reason that the mind, and a sense of self, is just an illusion, due to material processes, and nothing more, because, in this view, the information and the consciousness ultimately arose from matter, energy, and the laws of nature. And therefore it becomes easier for those who believe this idea to reason that in some situations you ultimately cannot make distinctions between intelligent design and non-intelligent processes of nature. But this seems like a logical inconsistency, because it is well established that intelligent causation is recognized and distinguished within forensic science and archaeology. But the chaos, suffering, and evil seem to eliminate the supernatural as a possibility. The relevance of meaning is brought into question. This is therefore at the very heart of why people feel the need to discuss this subject. It is one of the most fundamental questions about our reality that can be asked. This philosophy of disbelieving in supernatural causation is in opposition to the creationist model. Creationists claim that things must have started more organized and have since then degenerated, based on current observations of nature. This Darwinian belief system, of upward development from simple, less complex beginnings, is certainly an interesting idea, but can there be these kinds of upward changes somewhere in nature, over vast amounts of time? At first, this idea may sound plausible, when just speculating about it. To those of us with a purely naturalistic mindset in the science room, the incomplete hypothetical extrapolation from microevolution up to macroevolution might seem plausible at face value, but even an honest naturalist has to eventually give way to experiment and observation. But what does the observational science say? What do accurately conducted experiments show us? Are the arguments put forth by evolutionists purely rational, objective, and unbiased in their narrative? Do their reasons for promoting this theory come from strict scientific evidence, without any unproven belief whatsoever? Or is it somewhat ideologically driven? Is it based on cold hard logic, or is there an emotional component to it all? And is this a way for atheism to hijack science? Is there any form of increasing functional complexity that natural selection can grab hold of, and preserve, to enable nature to have enough power, so that biological evolution can then climb Mount Improbable, like Dawkins suggests? Does simply asking such logical questions provoke unreasonable emotional responses in some of the people who are advocates of the unproven upward evolution doctrine, and if so, why? John Horgan, in an article entitled, "The Mystery of Life, Darwinism Doesn't Solve It," says, "I know Dawkins knows how utterly improbable we are, because I have discussed the matter with him. Yet he seems to think that if he allows us weak-minded mortals to perceive that naked truth too directly, we will succumb to creationism, or mysticism, or theories, such as Gaia, which is wishful thinking dressed up as science. Of course, most of us will succumb. But Dawkins should at least give us the chance to savor one of the great paradoxes of our era before we slip into darkness. The more that science explains our existence, the more implausible we seem." W. R. Thompson wrote the critical 16-page introduction for the 1956 Everyman edition of Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species and made this comment about Darwinian evolution. When he said an insightful statement, which still holds up today, he wrote, "This general tendency to eliminate, by means of unverifiable speculations, the limits of the categories nature presents to us, is the inheritance of biology from the origin of the species. To establish the continuity required by theory, historical arguments are invoked, even though historical evidence is lacking. Thus are engendered those fragile towers of hypothesis based on hypothesis, where fact and fiction intermingle in an inextricable confusion." W. R. Thompson, Introduction to Every Man's Library issue of Charles Darwin, Origin of Species. The Neo-Darwinian ideology rests upon three main assumptions. 1. It is taken for granted that similarities in biology can often be used as evidence in agreement with the idea of common descent. 2. It is claimed that natural selection acting on variation and mutations can sometimes produce increasing levels of functional complexity. 3. It is speculated that lots of time can perhaps make possible specific types of highly improbable occurrences to allow generation of accumulating upward evolution in biology that mindless natural processes might select for preservation and replication for future generations to inherit. You need to have faith in those things to believe the Darwinian stories of life's origins. In some cases, the lots of time needed argument is used as an ad hoc excuse or rescue device for the absence of required scientific evidence for increasing complexity or incomplete information, and often makes such hypotheses difficult, maybe impossible, to test or falsify in a laboratory setting. you will invariably find that all the evidence falls into one, two, or all three of these categories, and they often make appeals to consensus or claimed authority figures. So, evolutionists make appeals to lots of time, similarities, natural selection, consensus, and claimed authorities, and that is much of the content. Is there anything else? From a scientific perspective, we would want to see reproducible, experimental evidence. Science ultimately requires facts, not only assumptions. Nonetheless, assumptions do provide us with a good way of openly asking the questions to begin with. So, there are two main ideas in the world. One idea says that life was made by an intelligent designer. The other belief is materialistic, that life is generated by natural processes only, and over vast amounts of time. These two beliefs are not mutually exclusive. The notion of intelligent creation does not necessarily negate vast time periods within the universe, and some forms of evolution. Many on both sides of the argument commit the fallacy of oversimplification in this regard.